The average person is said to spend 15 minutes in the bathroom. Why not take advantage of that time and learn something new? Presenting the 15-minute podcast on weird facts, crazy details, and funny particulars that you'll be able to enjoy while you're taking on your free time. Welcome to The Shit with Sam Butler. Welcome to another episode of The Shit Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Butler. I'm glad to be back, guys. I'm here in the studio. This is episode 112. I want to thank you guys for liking, subscribing, hitting the notifications bell on the podcast. I think it's awesome that you guys support the English podcast. I want to thank all the schools out there that are utilizing it as a teaching tool. I think that's awesome. I'm privileged to do that for you all. It's my pleasure. But let's get this episode going. I didn't know what I was going to talk about this week till a few days ago. I have some topics kind of set aside, but I said I don't know what I really want to talk about. And I came across this one article, and it was like, yeah, I think that's appropriate for this podcast, because this is the Shit Podcast. Now, remember, the whole idea is that this is a topic of conversation that you can utilize, wherever you're at, to open up a conversation. So we're going to talk about the I-400 submarine. The I-400 submarine is a submarine that I had no idea existed. I consider myself a little bit of a World War II buff, although I'm not a historian or anything, but I do really like reading up on stuff that happened during World War II, and there was a lot of crazy stuff. And a lot of the crazy stuff really started happening in World War I. And actually, this submarine is unique because this was the Japanese submarine. And this was like Japan's brainchild. They were like, this is going to be totally awesome. And when I was reading articles about it, it changed my perspective on what exactly Japan's intentions were for World War II. So I read a couple articles. One of the articles said that in actuality, Japan did not want to go to war with the United States. What they wanted was to embarrass them. So much that it would keep the United States from attempting to go to war. So the whole Pearl Harbor thing, which is a whole different perspective for me, I never really thought about it that way. I always thought it was like, we'll cripple the U.S. fleet. By crippling the U.S. fleet, we have the advantage. It would take them forever to get their fleet back up, and we're done. We conquer. Well, some of the articles, Yamamoto obviously was, for y'all that are familiar with World War II, General Yamamoto was the main dude, and his idea was that the United States would back down, they would feel defeated, they would feel embarrassed. Little did he know that was like waking a sleeping giant, because the United States was a very industrialized nation at that time. We were building stuff since the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution had happened. We were, Carnegie Steel was up and running. Ford Motor Company was up and running. Harley Davidson was up and running. So all these major companies that were already manufacturing were operational, and they shifted their production to wartime production. So it wasn't very long before we had replaced everything that was lost, plus we were adding. So and that was one of the huge underestimations that the Japanese government did. Well, what does that have to do with the submarine? What's amazing about this submarine is that it was a huge submarine. It was the biggest submarine ever made at that point in time, because it was an aircraft carrier submarine. So if you can imagine an aircraft carrier, a boat carrying planes. Well, the Japanese said, let's make it an aircraft carrier, but let's make it go underwater. Now, that to me was like, whoa. I immediately, when I read the article, I started looking for pictures. I started Googling. I wanted to know more. And it was pretty amazing that this was not a brand new idea. This actually started happening in World War I, and the Germans were the ones that had started to develop submarines that could carry airplanes. So could you imagine going underwater, having an airplane, and when you look at some of the pictures on the World War One submarines, they have like the paper airplanes, like the Wright brothers type airplanes, and they're actually pulling this airplane off the submarine and then launching it. So I was like dumbfounded when I read this. I didn't know what they were talking about, and I just couldn't visualize what was being said. So I looked up a lot of information. There's actually YouTube videos out there talking about the submarine, and it's not. I mean, it's pretty fantastic, the idea. So this is what happened. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and since they bombed Pearl Harbor, they said, okay, we now need a ship that could get us all the way to the east coast of the United States. Now, the east coast, that's like underwater all the way around through the Panama Canal, which they probably couldn't do. So they'd have to come around South America, right above Antarctica, go all the way to the east coast, and then come up out of the water close enough to launch airplanes and have these airplanes drop torpedo bombers. So that was their big plan. They said, okay, we're going to make 18 of these submarines, 18, and we'll have half of our fleet in the Atlantic and the other half in the Pacific, and we'll attack the country at the same time. And it would have worked. That's one of those things that had they been able to pull it off, it would have been devastating for the United States. What happened though was that this was a pretty grandiose idea, and to achieve an aircraft carrier that could carry any kind of airplanes, it had to be huge, and they could only carry 3 of their airplanes, and it wasn't their typical Zero airplane, the torpedo bomber that they used. They had to actually develop an airplane that could be broken down and stored away. So if you can imagine, you have this giant submarine that's twice as big as any other submarine, which also runs off of diesel. And if you know anything about submarines or anything, diesel's loud underwater, so you could detect it. They also built the submarine, I believe they built it with riveted edges, which was a big mistake when you build submarines, because one of the things that you do to defeat submarines is you drop depth charges, and they're barrels and they explode, or mines and they explode, and so it wasn't welded together because they didn't have time to weld it together, and it was riveted together. And so then they had this like capsule on the top part of the submarine. They also had to develop a catapult, something that could launch the airplane. But then they also had to I know that you think of kamikazes, you think of suicide bombers, but they actually wanted to retrieve the airplanes. So how do you get the airplanes back onto the submarine after they've deployed? That was a lot of things to consider. So what they did is they came up with a smaller version of their typical Zero that could carry a torpedo, could carry a couple of bombs, it could carry some ammunition. And then they put floats on the landing gear that were detachable. So you could fly the airplane without the bottom floats. But if you did that was a suicide mission. You'd have to like crash back into the ocean, or you could land in the water, and then they had a crane that they would assemble on the outside of the submarine that would pick the airplane out of the water, set it back down, they deconstruct it and slide it back into this capsule. Now, one of the biggest issues that they had is that they wanted to be able to do this in like less than 30 minutes. So the idea was that the submarine would be submerged. It would get within a few kilometers, like 200 or 300 kilometers from their target. They would all come up at the same time. They would pull the hatch back on this capsule that they built, housing 3. They could only house 3 per submarine, but they had the idea that they were going to have like 9 submarines on one side and 9 on the other side. So they'd be able to launch 27 airplanes. That's a pretty good load. And they'd be able to take off, drop their bombs, and make it back. And while they're doing that, the submarines can be safely underwater. Well, the fastest they were able to do it was like 45 minutes. to launch one airplane. So it would take them 2 hours to get all three of them off of a submarine. The other issue that they had was that it took them a long time to develop all of this technology. And they had an ambitious goal of 18. They scaled that back down to 10. Eventually, they scaled that down to 8. And finally, towards the end of the war, they were saying, what if we just build 5? And they were able to build 3. They were only able to build 3 of these I-400 series with all the accessories. And so then their idea was, let's go bomb the Panama Canal. And if we bomb the Panama Canal, that'll cripple the economy, that'll cripple the United States. Well, what happened was when they were finally kind of operational, the war in Japan ended. And it took them, they started building them in 1942. All of the design and development, research and development took them till 1945 to have one kind of operation. It was like the I-400, it was the I-400, I-401, I-402. And it shocked the United States when Japan surrendered because they didn't know that they existed. That was another issue that was kind of a big deal. They said, they didn't know. They thought that it was a cargo submarine that was designed to get supplies from one end of the world to the other end of the world and not be detected. And they thought that was pretty clever. But it wasn't until later, after the war ended, that the United States actually found out what their actual plan was. And you know, that would have been a total game changer for the war. I think it was pretty ambitious. It takes a long time to develop new technology. That technology should have been like locked and loaded and ready to go. But it also shows you that, you know, what are we, 80 years from World War II or more? I mean, World War II was in the 40s. Yeah, we're 40. We're 80. We're 80 years away from World War II. That's pretty advanced technology for World War II. How do you build a submarine? First of all, how do you you go depths. How do you survive underwater? How do you have the right kind of air underwater to breathe and not die? And then how do you go so far? I mean, this thing had to be so big that it could go around the world and come home without being detected, without being refueled. That was a big reason. But to me, to find out that there was an aircraft carrier submarine during World War II just seemed like a pretty cool topic. And I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode of the Ship Podcast. It's the I-400 class. You can look up a lot of different submarine classes. They started in World War I. If you guys have a chance, please leave your comments in the channel. I read them. I comment on them. I appreciate them. And share the episode with your friends. It's a pleasure doing this once more. One more thing about submarines. I think we did an episode where we talked extensively about submarines. I kind of remember. It's been a bunch of episodes. But I think the first submarines were developed like in the 1600s, if you can believe that. So 1600s, they had submarines. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was even like some ideas that some of the Roman armies were trying to do submarine technology. So the technology has existed a long time, but this was a total shock for me to find out that there was actually a submarine aircraft carrier. And with that, I'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys. Remember, if you want to follow me on my social media, you can find me as Tu Amigo Sam. That's TU Amigo. Now, on my personal Instagram page, it's Tu Amigo, one word, Sam, second word. And on my comedian page, it's TU Amigo, second word, Sam is the third word. I'm sorry. And you can find me on Spotify and all of the podcast platforms as Sta Cagado Podcast. I want to thank the Cagadienses, the Facebook group, and everybody else that supports the page. That's it for this episode of the Shit Podcast. I'll catch you guys next week.